Hey, are you ready to grow your business? You have checked out the number one resource for business leaders, entrepreneurs, startup founders, and managers. And we're going to teach you how to grow and scale your business with real actionable steps. There's no fluff in this podcast. It's just good advice. Check out this episode. If you're a first-time listener, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoy this episode, leave us a 5-star review. Today's episode is with LaTonya Wilkins, who's the author of Leading Below the Surface, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. It's an incredible book. You can find it on Amazon, and it's especially important for anyone who is managing someone in any capacity and is thinking about the culture of their business. This was an awesome episode. You definitely want to tune in for the entire episode. LaTonya makes so many great insights. All that to say, enjoy this episode. Here comes your good advice. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Good Advice Podcast. One of the things I love to talk about is leadership and management. And it's something that in today's culture, we're finding ourselves wondering, how do we find those really great employees? More importantly, how do we keep those great employees? How do we nurture in a work environment where people are like, yeah, not only do I like to work here, but I feel like I can really flourish here. We're talking about getting away from that Sunday night feeling of, oh, I don't know if I can do another week at this place, versus living and working in a business where you're like, wow, this is really pinging all of my skill sets. And more importantly, I feel like I can be who I am. Today on the podcast, we have LaTonya Wilkins. She's the author of Leading Below the Surface, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. She works with all sorts of businesses, from leadership to culture to diversity and inclusion. We're going to be talking about how you can transform and shape your workplace into that psychologically safe place for you and your coworkers. More to come in this episode. LaTonya, it's great to have you here today.
Great to be here, Blake. Thank you.
How's your day going?
No, it's going pretty well. I had a vacation that I'm coming off of, and from Tulum, Mexico. So it's just very grateful I could take that trip safely.
Okay, so what took you to Mexico? Why Mexico of anywhere else?
I've always wanted to go to Tulum. I think I knew about Tulum because of all the yoga retreats that were thrown at me in that area. Okay. And so we ended up staying right on the beach. And
where is Tulum?
So Tulum is in the Yucatan Peninsula.
Okay.
And so we went to the Mayan ruins, Chichen Itza, and we swam in cenotes. And cenotes, if people aren't familiar with
I'm
those.
an expert on this only because my wife was just in Mexico last week. And so she gave me the whole scoop on, and I was like, what is this? And so, because her sister eloped in Mexico. And so she was in Mexico too. I'm totally like now stepping on your story. All that to say, I know a little bit. And so I already feel a little connected to you now, but I interrupted you. What is a cenote? Let's talk to the audience a little bit about
I would love
this.
to hear what your thoughts. So everybody has a different metaphorical perspective of what a cenote is, but I think of them as Mayan holy water, because they were formed as like sinkholes in the ground, and then they were filled with natural fresh water. And so when you swim in it, it's just amazing, usually underground in a cave. And it's, I took my GoPro down there.
Oh, yeah.
It's just beautiful. Lots of fish.
Your explanation is so much better than my wife's explanation, which was, we went to this cave and there was like a lake in it or like a pond, and it's a cenote. And I was like, okay, that's interesting.
Well, my partner is reading. Her explanation of it is it's the umbilical cord of the earth.
Okay.
That's but they're very significant. So if you ever get a chance to go, it's way more than a pond.
I love it. That's great. Well, so you finally got back from vacation, and have you recovered from vacation, or are you still in kind of like
I have
that?
Not.
Yeah.
The struggle is real.
Oh yeah.
It's been very hard. Very, very difficult.
It's tough. It's tough to come back from a vacation and go straight back into work, but it is easier though if it's a job you love, which it seems like you're doing what you love on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's a little different because giving you a little background. So this is probably my second year, probably second year, going into my second year doing business full time by myself, like running my business.
Yeah.
And before I was working I was teaching at the Geese College of Business and also doing some culture work there. And I did that for several years. And then I decided to go on my own. And so it's much different returning from a vacation. If you're a business owner, I'm sure many of you can relate to that. It's a whole different ballgame. And so it's been very difficult. I mean, I have to remind myself that this is new and this is something I've never done before. It's different from being an employee and going back in the office and someone covered for you. I have an assistant in my business and she covered for me, but I don't have a whole team like a corporation has. That is making sure everything keeps running. Well,
when you're a 9-to-5 employee, it's exactly what you just said. I mean, the wheel keeps turning, and when you're on vacation, everything just stops. And so I know for me, it's hard to not worry about lost opportunity or things that aren't getting done because I'm not around. It's definitely a different world that I think a lot of the listeners can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you're in your second year of the Change Coaches LLC. Talk to us a little bit about what you do, some of the services you offer. What is life like for you and your business?
Yeah, so I could tell you a little bit of a story about how this started because it's probably a little bit more interesting than me just giving you a spiel of my products.
The marketing, the About Me page. Right. No, this is great. I love stories.
I'm not that kind of person.
I love it. Okay,
I really have
give
a
us the
hard
story.
time with self-promotion, and unless it's authentic self-promotion or self-promotion that people.
But nowadays when people say authentic, even that is.
I know.
Someone's like, I'm just so authentic, and you're like, okay, I know. Okay.
I like you already.
Yeah,
yes.
Sure.
Yeah. So about probably 3 years ago, I decided I was going to finally go through coach training. My mentor of many years kept urging me to be a coach. And I was like, I'm already a coach. I worked before the university. I worked in many different Fortune 500 companies, consulting firms, very corporate career, MBA. And then I was deciding what was next. I was working at the university. I was figuring out, hey, what do I want to do when I grow up? And what I decided is I was going to take my mentor up, go to coach training, became a coach, started career coaching, hated it. If people were so unreliable, and I'm like, why am I doing this? This is ridiculous. And so then I had this light bulb in my head, a light bulb moment where I thought, wait, why am I trying to hit the reset button? I've already been doing some form of coaching in my career. Right. Why not do corporate coaching? So that's when I moved to. I've always been a cultural leader. And so I started coaching organizations, mainly teams and executives, to create cultures of belonging. I also coach executives who are the only ones at work. I run like a whole suite of workshops. And then we do things we call culture academies with organizations that are usually around how to create a culture of belonging. And so those are the big things that I do these days.
Talk to us a little bit about, because it feels like people who get this concept get really passionate about it. And especially business owners who really, they get the value of that culture that you're talking about. And then there's this other group of people who are a little bit more distant to it. And so when you start talking about, borrowing your words, a culture of belonging, I've known executives to be very standoffish with that term of like, it's really in the feelings. Like, what is that? I mean, are we even going to get work done anymore? Talked a little bit about, what do you mean by this? Like, what is culture really? And maybe we can help, I think people who listen to the podcast don't necessarily think this because we talk about culture a lot on the podcast, but, what are some ways you help enlighten some of the more naive leaders who aren't really clear on what culture is?
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I wrote my book called Leading Below the Surface. It's out there now, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. Amy Edmondson of Harvard Business School, who invented psychological safety or coined that term, wrote my foreword. And I wrote this book for those people that are skeptics about building cultures of belonging. It's too feely. We're not going to make enough money. So many examples. Blake, I will tell you, I've been around the block. I've worked in so many different large corporations where it was ROI, ROI, ROI. We always had dashboards. I know how to create ROI. And I'm pretty damn sure that everything I talk about works, and I know it works, and I've seen it work. And so I've had the unique background where I've had both of those experiences together as an entrepreneur and in corporations. So what do I do? So how do I create cultures of belonging? Well, I will tell you, over the last year or so, I've had several clients come to me, and I've turned them down, potential clients, because they come to me and they're wanting to change their culture, but all they want is training.
Right.
And so to your point with the feelings, I talk about meandering in the muck, and you have to lead below the surface. You have to get to the deepest levels of muck and grossness to get there. And in order to get in, when you get there, that's when you access what your culture really is, whether you like it or not. A lot of organizations are not accessing their culture. They're asking me to come in and mold their cultures in a day or over weeks. And they haven't even sat in the muck of what their culture actually is.
Yeah. It's like you come in and make I don't want to put words in your mouth. What I've seen in my world is you come in and make my frontline people make me more money, rather than understanding that it's the environment that's being shaped that's affecting the results that they're achieving. And I've seen a lot of executives who almost are in kind of denial about, like, I love how you framed that of actually being in the muck. And what I was thinking of was actually having those honest, real conversations with your employees where they tell you what work is like and what the culture is like. It seems like a lot of people aren't necessarily willing to have those conversations or have that kind of transparency with their teams.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I call it the three-legged stool of leading below the surface, and real conversations are part of that. I have a concept I call real leadership. That's an acronym. And real leaders are relatable. They are equitable, aware, and loyal. So that's REAL. They're also, the second leg of the stool is empathetic. And the third is creating psychologically safe relationships. And this is the essence of creating a culture of belonging. It's interesting that you say that, because that's all you have to do. I've always hated DEI because it's not a separate thing. It's really about creating a culture of belonging. And these three legs of the stool work for that. But there's so many people that, they're resistant to DEI, or they want to do DEI because they think they're just throwing something at the wall until it sticks. But this is really how you do it. And it's not easy. It's really, a lot of people have to rewire their brain. They have to do a lot of practice. They're basically, in my book, you're being coached. It's a self-coaching book. So you can grow into this mindset over time. And that's how your organization is going to change when your mindset changes and your leaders' mindset change. It's all about the structures and systems. This is a structure and a system where the entire culture changes of an organization based on how people are treating people.
Well, and I think about, like, someone on that journey of rewiring how they see things and reframing how they see things. Harvard Business Review actually talked a lot about this topic of self-awareness, and like how many people are actually self-aware in the sense of how they perceive themselves, how they perceive their own leadership capacity, and how it's affecting the people they work with. And pretty surprisingly, as HBR framed it, only 10% of people are actually self-aware in the sense of what they envision and who they actually are that same person. And so it seems like when we talk about diversity and inclusion initiatives, in many cases, it's hard for even people who are maybe I'm trying to think of the right phrasing, maybe the biggest offenders of the kind of culture or that environment that you're wanting to create. It seems like it's hard for those individuals to realize, I kind of think about like the random viral videos where like the person's being obviously racist and they say, I'm not a racist. And then they say something incredibly offensive. In the workplace, it seems like something like is also happening, where maybe not that abrasive, but people who are harming that potentially safe environment, but yet, it's not me. I mean, it couldn't be me. It's got to be someone else. Do you find yourself having these conversations with people where you sort of help them understand their role, I guess, or the level of impact that they're creating as the leader?
Yeah. And I think this kind of goes back to the real leadership model. So I talk about relatability, being an equitable leader, aware leader, and a loyal leader. And aware is something that you're talking about here. And I think what's hard, Blake, is I get a lot of leaders that are like, oh my gosh, like I can't worry about every single thing I say. So that's very episodic, right? It's like the fears in you, it's episodic instead of cultural, right? So shifting from that episodic feeling of say this, don't say that, or are you racist or you're not? I mean, come on, that stuff is just, that doesn't help anyone, right? But what does help, again, is thinking about your culture, being aware about who you are and listening to that. And the way that you do that is I talk about two different types of listening in leading below the surface. I talk about person to person listening, kind of like what we're doing now, listening, active listening. You're actively listening to me. I'm actively listening to you, playing back what we hear. And then I talk about P2B listening. And that's a new concept for many people. And that's when you are listening to see the extent to which someone belongs in the workplace. And that gives you, just being an observer gives you a lot more awareness about yourself, how you're perceived, gives you awareness around how your team interacts with you, how they perceive you, how they perceive the organization. So all of these things, I mean, it goes beyond, of course, there's that entry level of, I'm going to do manager feedback, 360 feedback. But the deeper piece of that are, again, this three-legged stool, which is the real relationships, the empathetic listening, and then psychological safety. And
is that real relationship, is that sort of the basis for how you build the trust to be able to have these honest conversations?
Yeah.
Because it does feel like we're in a bit of a viral world where like I don't want what I say to end up somewhere online. Mm-hmm. But I also, it seems like when we think about that collaborative, empowering workspace, it seems like you have to be able to have that environment where someone says, hey, what you did there was actually pretty offensive to me and it was hurtful. And for the other person to hear that and receive that, and I guess in the presence of the relationship say, oh my gosh, like I had no idea that I had done that. And I guess what I'm getting at is it's such a great concept. And yet I think people listening know firsthand that it feels like that kind of environment is modeled by the person at the top. And yet so often, not to sound cynical, but we work in those work environments where it is very much, this is training for you all. These are things that you guys need to worry about. I don't know. I don't know if this matches your experience or not, or I don't know.
You mean the piece of being able to say if something is offensive and having that a psychologically safe relationship. So you can do that.
I think maybe I'm imposing my own background, which is typically it's leaders who have been more egocentric and more unwilling to see their role, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that goes back to, psychological safety. And it's, you're not going to, you can bring yourself to work, you can take risk at work without repercussions. Right. And if that situation came up with my boss and I felt like my boss was talking over me, or I felt like my boss promoted all my male colleagues before they promoted me, I should be able to go to my boss if I have psychological safety and say that without feeling like I'm going to be ostracized for expressing my opinion. And that's something, again, that is still lacking in the workplace. Again, when we talk about diversity and having these real conversations, we're not creating psychologically safe environments where, people won't be penalized for what they say. People are still very afraid of that. Even in listening sessions, when I facilitate those, they're afraid to say anything that could be perceived bad by the company or could be taken personally by what you said, like the CEO.
How do you keep people from, and it's just a question of curiosity. It feels like people today are so great at picking up talking points politically, or like whatever was on Facebook or what have you. Yeah. How do you help people hash out these conversations without simply putting on that political hat? Someone makes a comment, oh, well, you're just, and they say something that they've read on Facebook, you're part of this group, or oh, you just must believe this. I mean, is that also modeled by the leader who kind of gets people on the same page for how they have these conversations? Or because it does feel like, politically speaking, it's become harder and harder to have conversations with people who are different than you without like this potential for, okay, that was a really fiery conversation.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, with the teams I coach, so a couple of them have actually brought up political diversity, and I've never really thought of that but it is a diversity. It's kind of like neurodiversity, right? Where people think differently. What I try to do, though, Blake, is I try to, when I coach teams, we talk about kind of what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, and politics is out of bounds. Even when I teach students, it's because usually political views they're not political views. I mean, they're like the manifestations of people's fears, or their people's values. But the way that they talk about those values is kind of like me against us, against you, me against you kind of thing. And that's why I don't like the way that's framed. So I usually let the group decide. As far as my opinion's different than yours, I'll share a story. I was in a session once with a colleague. Like, we were running a session together. And after the session, this was a male colleague, he confronted me about my salary because I was paid more than him. And he basically blamed that on everything that was going on in the world, and that not about my qualifications. It had to be because I was a Black woman. And it's really hard to do this. I think I'm not telling everybody to do this. I think as a coach, it's something that I can access and do, and that's curiosity. And, I was angry, I was boiling. So I took a minute to kind of step away and kind of just let myself simmer down a little bit. And then I said to him, I'm curious, where is that perspective coming from? Where is that? Where's what you said where's that coming from? And, it really had nothing to do with politics or his opinion. It had to do with his insecurities. And I think it's like getting to that, which is so hard because we are so quick to jump and judge. And I get it. We're triggered, but I think it's the question here is, how can we allow ourselves to be triggered and be upset, but also at the same time try to be curious? And if that doesn't work, how can we create some boundaries and still be able to work together?
You went back to the conversation rather than I'm done with you and I'm never going to speak to you again.
No, I never do that.
And I think that is some of the magic of what you're talking about, is these teams building these collaborative relationships. When we say collaborative, we don't just mean like you work on a project together, but you're able to have that open and honest dialogue. And something you said earlier, I think is really powerful, is you mentioned essentially taking risks. And am I going to be someone to speak up and sort of wear that black hat and say, I don't know if that's a great idea, or maybe this can't work. And in an environment where you don't feel safe to do that, you're going to have a lot of yes people who aren't necessarily going to speak up. And that's a direct tie to the results that the business is achieving. So I think that's powerful for all of us listening, is understanding that it's another point towards, we're not talking about warm feelings. We're actually talking about an environment where people, like when we talk about innovation and trying new things and testing the market, these are all things that come out of this kind of collaborative relationship. Does Maslow's hierarchy of needs come up in your work at all?
It does. It does. And the way that I talk about it is, safety is a basic need. And it's interesting because, again, these organizations call me and they want me to basically work magic, which I can't do if the basics aren't there. Because a basic need is safety, a basic need is belonging in order to get to the higher parts of the pyramid. So yeah, I talk about that concept a lot.
Yeah. And so for our listeners, as LaTonya mentioned, basically envision a pyramid, and at the very top is like your, it's self-actualization, like you're living out your calling, so to speak. The only way to reach the top of that is to meet the needs below it. And like LaTonya mentioned, literally your physical and emotional safety is one of your biggest needs. And so, LaTonya, this is a topic that comes up a lot in some of my own content on, well, you have a boss, for example, who says, well, I want that employee who is going to be a rock star. Like I want that employee who's going to make me 10 times what I'm paying them. And sometimes it's hard to make that connection between that successful, powerful employee and my role as a boss actually meeting their most basic needs. And it comes up a lot, I think, in today's culture of minimum wage and what is a living wage and what can that do for our employees. And it's always interesting. I talked to someone who she was trying to figure out how to pay her employees less than minimum wage, which she was like, surely there's like a loophole. And I was like, no, there's, please stop doing this. But she was also I want all my employees to be these rock star people, not understanding that their basic needs aren't being met. So I'm not surprised to hear that it comes up in your own work.
Yeah, I love that you brought up minimum wage. Do you ever read Dan Price? And
he's the Seattle, or maybe he's Portland. I have a really bad habit. Like my friends from Seattle and Portland both make fun of me because I always mix up who's from where. But so for our listeners, Dan Price, he what's the name of the business he was the CEO of, or he is the CEO?
It's payments. It's a payments company, and it's Gravity Payments. Is the name of it.
So he made headlines, I guess it was about 5 or 6 years ago, because he essentially said, hey, we're going to get rid of our tiered pay systems, and everyone's going to be making, I think it was at least $70,000 or something like that. It was whatever some study had come out to say was like the bare minimum for a happy, healthy life. And there were some very angry people who wrote to him that he was very open about. But actually, many of his customers wrote to him and said how much they admired what he was doing for his employees. And interestingly enough, 5 years later, he has proved the masses wrong. He is still in business, and he's actually become quite the vocal figure on this topic.
Thriving. Yeah. His employees actually work harder, and they work more without him asking, and that's not even what he's advocating. So he's figured out like the Jedi mind trick for right.
And here's what's interesting to me though, LaTonya, is I feel like we have these conversations a lot on like how do you motivate your people, but like we're not actually really willing to do the work. It's like okay, tell me how to make my employees happier, but don't tell me to pay them more. Mm-hmm. And it's like this weird. It's like, okay, well. I don't know, but that's often kind of, I don't know if we're just, because of like an iPod, we're just trying to get like to the quickest, what's the quickest way I can get to the answer? I don't know. It's weird, and I'm sure you have these conversations a lot where you have to sort of educate and help leaders understand there's not necessarily a quick, yay, we did a training, like now we have a safe work environment.
And all this stuff is even more important because I'm sure all of you and all your listeners have heard of the Great Resignation, and people want more from their jobs. And so what's happening is masses of people are having existential crises about work. Even some of my clients, so clients will pay me to coach one of their executives, and then like 4 weeks later, like, peace out. I'm like, I'm going somewhere else, and I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's happening more and more where, luckily with many of the situations I come into, I get in there early enough to kind of be able to coach the person so they can have better communication with the companies they're at. But people want more. I mean, they want the basics as Blake you're talking about, but they also want to be able to have deeper connections. They actually want to have work that's more aligned with their values, they actually want more meaning. And if you're one of those CEOs that, like you mentioned at the beginning, oh, this is too feely, touchy, then you're not going to have employees, because this is what they care about. I mean, it's messy. It's like humans are messy. They're not perfect. And, just with, and then we were talking about this before we started recording, like 90% of my clients have small children. And, I tell them, don't apologize for your children. And the mishaps they put in your schedule. That's how it goes. And so we have to be, again, just more understanding. And if you're not, then your employees are not going to stay.
Right. And I think it's interesting. What's funny, you mentioned the small children. I texted my wife about 10 minutes ago and I was like, I can literally hear her screaming. So I don't want people to think I'm abusing my child in the background, but here's what's weird to me is so we have this massive worker shortage, and naturally it's really obnoxious how politicized it's become. But I love how you phrased it. This, we're coming out of COVID and it's sort of this existential, especially for people who worked in work environments where their boss or their business didn't necessarily take care of their physical safety. I think they especially are really wondering, like, why am I putting myself out there? But LaTonya, as you're talking, like, this concept feels so simple. And I feel like when I talk to people, it's not hard for me to find other people who are like, yeah, of course, like, take care of your people. Of course, like, pay them a living wage. Of course. And yet it feels like there's still such this weird disconnect. Is it generational? Like, is it people who've been in business for 30 years are now suddenly like, oh, wow, like I have to take, I mean, no one's going to tell you that they don't want to take care of their people. And yet it feels like the younger people in business that I'm talking to, it's a more natural, intuitive, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people who've been in business a long time who get this concept. But it does feel like this strange old guard versus, people who are coming into business who haven't been in it as long as others, who are more naturally inclining themselves towards this.
It's interesting you say that. And I don't know, like, I've been trying to put my finger on it. I don't know. Some of it's probably industry. Some of it's probably age. Some of it's probably compounding factors. But the one metaphor or analogy I want to give you is that, there are people that struggle in the world, and some people are willing to go to a therapist or a coach, right? And kind of talk about their struggles and get through their struggles. So there's that camp of people. And then there's a camp of people that are like, heck no, I'm not going to a therapist. Like, why would I go to a therapist? Like, I know I'm in control of my life. So I think it's kind of like that. Like, there's just the people that, and I do think that people that are younger, maybe they are more willing to go to therapy. I don't know why. I think there's just more, I think there's less stigma with younger people. Like, when you think about older people, like, people, when I think about my parents' age, like, they never were able to talk about feelings in the workplace. And now it's becoming more common. And it's just that the younger generation grew up with that. So I put it in two camps. Like, either you're willing or you're not. There are some people that are in between, but I don't know if it's age. I mean, I really think it's, I talk about Keegan's theories of human development. He talks about, the different levels. And I think it's the people that are at the higher levels of human development that are able to just tap into different parts of their human existence. And that's not just the prefrontal cortex, the rational side, but also the emotional side. And that's just how it is. And I help people be able to do that. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. It's funny, like, a lot of my male executive clients that are more traditional male, like, clients that are, CEOs of companies, they're always like, you're like my therapist. I'm like, oh, you're a therapist, but I guess you could think of me that way, because they never really had to think about business like this. Yeah. And now they're forced to, because of their workforce.
Yeah. Well, LaTonya, this has been a deep conversation. It's been a fun conversation. We're going to have you come back on the show. here down the road, maybe later this year, or I guess actually we're getting towards the end of the year. So next year we'll have to have you come back and share some more. Talk to me like what's happening next for you. You have this amazing book out. I'm excited to pick up a copy and check it out myself. What are you working on next? Is there going to be a second book? Is there going to be just digging down on more customers, more clients? What's happening next for you?
Down the road, there will be a second book. And my personal mission in life is to change the workplace for good and to create tons of below the surface leaders, millions of below the surface leaders. I talk about this on Clubhouse. And so that's what I'm focused on. I'll do that through courses so I can scale some of the content, some of the concepts, building a movement around this and building a movement of people that are not going to put up with all the leaders you were talking about earlier. I call those surface leaders in the book, but it's time for the workplace to change. These models aren't working.
Yeah. Well, and I you talk about people who won't put up with it. I empathize with people who don't necessarily know their worth enough, where they are going to that miserable job where they're unhappy and they're unfulfilled, and they think this is normal. I think this is what work is supposed to be like. Yeah. Which is very dreary when you think about what you're going to spend the next, 30, 40 years of your life doing. So props to you. And I'm excited to see where this goes for you. And I'm excited to get an update from you down the road. For people who are listening, who maybe they want to work with you, they want to connect with you, what's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah, the easiest way and the easiest thing to remember is leadingbelowthesurface.com. And so that's the landing page for the book. You can also, and you can access my website, everything else from there. Again, leadingbelowthesurface.com. I'm also on Instagram at LaTonya Wilkins, at LaTonya Coaching, and then also LinkedIn. And so you can connect with me on those. Those are my most active social networks.
And you're on Clubhouse too?
I'm on Clubhouse, and I'm building a community called Leading Below the Surface. It's a sanctuary space, I call it, for people that are fed up, that want to lead below the surface, or that do lead below the surface, but feel ostracized because of it, or feel like they don't fit in. It's an awesome community. Join. We don't do a lot of self-promotion. We just talk to each other and get below the surface with each other.
I feel like anyone who's on Clubhouse is like one level cooler, because it's like, it was exclusive, and like now people are getting on it. And so whenever someone's like, oh yeah, I'm on Clubhouse, I'm like, okay, wow, this person's the real deal. So what's your handle on Clubhouse?
Just LaTonya Wilkins. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, LaTonya, thanks so much for coming on the show today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Blake.
Hey, for our listeners, I'm going to put the link to the website, leadingbelowthesurface.com. I'm also going to put her Instagram and her LinkedIn profile links down in the episode description below, so you can check that out as well. And lastly, I'm going to have in the episode description, you can check it out. It's going to be a link to her book. You absolutely want to make sure you check out Leading Below the Surface, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. I promise it will make your life and your company, everyone working there, their lives better from checking this book out. So that'll be down in the episode description below. By the way, if you've been following the podcast for a while, what the heck are you waiting on? Click that subscribe button, click that follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you're at. And don't forget, if you want to support the podcast, you can go to our Patreon. It's at patreon.com/goodadvice. You can buy me a cup of coffee, which I like my coffee. So patreon.com/goodadvice. And as always, we appreciate you listening. Thanks for checking us out. And that's today's good advice. We'll catch you later.